I need to show you something that happened 4 days ago that nobody's talking about. Australia just publicly aligned with Canada against the United States, not behind closed doors, not in some diplomatic memo in front of Parliament on national television. And what you're about to hear changes everything about how the next decade of global politics is going to play out. Sunday, January 25th, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese goes on national broadcast and says 5 words that sent shockwaves through Washington. I agree with him. He's talking about Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney. And what Carney said 6 days earlier in Davos wasn't just bold. It was a declaration of independence from American economic power. Here's where it gets complicated. Carney stood in front of the world's most powerful people at the World Economic Forum and said something no Western leader has dared to say out loud in decades. The rules-based international order dead. The idea that America protects its allies over the assumption that middle powers like Canada, Australia, South Korea, and Indonesia should just accept whatever terms Washington offers, finished. Documents reveal that Carney used a phrase that's been echoing in foreign ministries around the world. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. He was talking about middle powers, countries that aren't superpowers but aren't small either, countries with resources, technology, educated populations, and something nobody expected, the willingness to coordinate without asking permission from Washington or Beijing. Wait, it gets worse. Trump watched that speech and he did not like it. The next day, Trump goes to Davos and says, I'm quoting directly here, Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements? Not exactly subtle. Trump accused Canada of getting freebies and said Carney wasn't grateful enough. But here's what nobody's talking about. Carney didn't back down. 4 days later, he's on camera in Ottawa saying, to be absolutely clear, I meant what I said in Davos. Treasury Secretary tried to claim Carney walked it back in a private phone call with Trump. Quelle réponse? No, this is the part that kept me up last night. Albanese didn't just praise Carney's speech. He invited him to address the Australian Parliament in March. Do you understand what that means? Parliamentary addresses aren't casual. They're reserved for major figures whose message is meant to travel, whose policies are serious enough to be placed before a legislature. This is strategic alignment happening in real time. And then this happened. Albanese said, I agree with him, referring to Carney's Davos speech. Not interesting perspective and not we'll consider it. I agree with him on national television in front of the world. That's Australia publicly declaring it's ready to move beyond the traditional American-led alliance model and build something different. Sources are now confirming what many suspected. This wasn't spontaneous. This was coordinated. In October, 4 months ago, Canada and Australia signed something called the Joint Declaration of Intent on Critical Minerals Cooperation. On paper, it's about lithium, rare earths, nickel, graphite, the materials that power everything from electric vehicles to missile defense systems. In reality, it's the foundation of an alternative supply chain that reduces dependence on both China and the United States. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture. China controls 70% of rare earth mining and 90% of processing. The United States has spent decades dependent on China for materials it needs to build weapons, semiconductors, and advanced technology. Trump knows this, which is why when Australia signed a deal with him in October worth $13 billion in projects, he called it a model for supply chain cooperation globally. But that's not even the real story. The real story is that Australia took Trump's framework and immediately turned around and applied the same model to Canada, same structure, same goals. But now it's middle powers coordinating with each other, not just responding to Washington. The Critical Minerals Agreement isn't just about trade. It's about building the infrastructure for strategic autonomy. Reports are coming in that over a dozen countries are watching this closely. Mexico's president openly praised Carney's message. South Africa, Indonesia, South Korea, Brazil, they're all asking the same question. Can middle powers actually do this? Can they build a network strong enough to reduce pressure from superpowers? Here's what nobody's talking about. For decades, the global order worked like this. America leads, allies follow, China dominates, Neighbors adapt. Russia orders. Satellites comply. The structure assumed middle powers lacked the capacity to act independently, that they were short on resources or couldn't coordinate effectively. Carney's Davos speech shattered that assumption. He laid out a vision where middle powers don't wait for direction. They set their own agenda. They coordinate collectively. They build alternative trade routes. They invest in each other's infrastructure. They reduce vulnerability to economic coercion by diversifying away from any single dominant power. And Australia just became the first country to openly commit to making that vision real. Let me tell you what's really happening here. What we're watching isn't just about Canada and Australia being frustrated with Trump. This goes deeper, way deeper. And the timeline reveals something most people aren't seeing. October 30th, 2025, Canada and Australia signed the critical minerals deal in Toronto, not in Washington, not at a G7 summit, at a bilateral meeting between two resource-rich middle powers who share a problem. They're both vulnerable to pressure from great powers that weaponize economic relationships. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The agreement doesn't just promote trade. It creates something called blended financing mechanisms using both countries' public investment tools. Translation. When a Canadian company wants to develop a lithium mine, Australia's government can co-invest. When an Australian firm wants to build a rare earth processing facility, Canada's defense stockpiling regime can provide support. This isn't aid. This is integrated strategic planning. The latest information shows that the deal prioritizes upstream production with midstream technologies. That's industry speak for. We're not just digging minerals out of the ground and shipping them elsewhere for processing. We're building the entire supply chain, mining, refining, processing, recycling across both countries. Why does that matter? Because whoever controls processing controls the supply chain. And right now, China controls processing. But that's not even the real threat to Washington. Here's what I'm not seeing enough people talk about. The Canada-Australia framework includes provisions for joint research, development, and demonstration projects with a focus on low-carbon and circular economy approaches. They're not just building supply chains. They're setting standards. And those standards are designed to lock out competitors who can't meet high environmental and social governance requirements. Wait, it gets worse. The agreement explicitly states both countries will work to ensure emerging standards-based markets capture the unique challenges that producers of high standards critical minerals face. Let me translate that. Canada and Australia are creating a club. If you want access to their materials, you have to meet their rules. And guess who doesn't want to meet those rules? China. And guess who's been pressuring allies to lower standards in exchange for market access? Also China. This is economic containment, but it's not coming from Washington. It's coming from Ottawa and Canberra. Sources are now confirming that the timing wasn't accidental. The minerals deal in October created the foundation. Carney's Davos speech in January created the political framework, and Albanese's invitation in late January created the public commitment. This is a three-step rollout designed to build momentum before anyone could organize opposition. Trump's reaction tells you everything you need to know about how seriously he's taking this. He didn't just criticize Carney. He threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian goods. He rescinded Canada's invitation to something called the Board of Peace, a Gaza oversight initiative that carries a $1 billion membership fee. He called Carney Governor Mark in a social media post mocking Canadian sovereignty. And he told the world, Canada lives because of the United States. That's not diplomacy. That's a warning shot. But here's the thing Trump didn't anticipate. Every time he threatens Canada, he proves Carney's point. The Davos speech argued that great powers are using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion. Trump's response, exactly that. Threaten tariffs, mock sovereignty, demand gratitude, and what did Carney do? He doubled down. He told reporters, I meant what I said in Davos. He outlined plans for 12 new trade deals across 4 continents in 6 months. He said Canada will aim to double its non-U.S. exports. And then he smiled and said Trump was impressed when they spoke on the phone. Now, what I'm about to show you is the part that changes everything Albanese's parliamentary invitation isn't scheduled for next week. It's scheduled for March. Why March? Because that gives Carney 2 months to visit other middle powers, sign agreements, build coalitions, and arrive in Australia with momentum. The speech won't be about theory, it'll be about results. The latest information shows Australia is already moving beyond rhetoric. They're negotiating parallel deals with Indonesia on nickel processing. They're exploring partnerships with South Korea on battery technology. They're in talks with India on rare earth refining. Each agreement reduces dependence on China's processing capabilities. Each one makes the network stronger. Here's what kept me up last night. What happens when Canada, Australia, South Korea, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, and South Africa start coordinating on critical minerals, trade routes, technology standards, and investment frameworks? What happens when they stop competing with each other for favor from Washington or Beijing and start building collective strength? You get a third pole in global politics, not aligned with America, not aligned with China, something different. A network of middle powers with enough combined economic weight, technological capacity, and resource control to resist pressure from any single superpower. That's what Carney's speech was really about, and that's what Australia's response confirmed is actually possible. Reports are coming in that officials in other capitals are paying very close attention, not just to what Carney and Albanese are saying, but to whether they can actually deliver. Can two middle powers turn rhetoric into institutional frameworks? Can they build trade networks that work? Can they create alternative supply chains that reduce strategic vulnerability? The answer to those questions will determine whether we're watching a moment of frustration that fades or the beginning of a fundamental restructuring of global power. Okay, so here's what most analysis is missing. This isn't just about tariffs. This isn't just about Greenland or Trump's ego or whether Canada joins some peace board. The question underneath everything we're watching is this: can the international system function when the dominant power stops playing by its own rules? Let me explain what I mean. For 70 years, the American order worked because even when the U.S. bent the rules, it maintained the fiction that rules existed. That gave middle powers something to point to, something to appeal to, something to organize around. But what Carney said in Davos, what he actually said was that the fiction is over. He quoted a Czech dissident named Václav Havel who wrote about living within a lie. Havel asked, how did the communist system sustain itself? His answer was that everyone participated in rituals they privately knew were false. A shopkeeper puts a sign in his window saying, "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't believe it. No one believes it. But he puts it there anyway to signal compliance. The system persists not through violence alone, but through collective performance. And then Havel said something that echoes through Carney's speech. When even one person stops performing, when the green grocer removes his sign, the illusion begins to crack. Carney told the Davos audience, friends, it is time for companies and countries to take their signs down. Now, here's where it gets complicated. What does that actually mean in practice? It means stop pretending that multilateral institutions still function when great powers ignore their rulings. Stop pretending that trade agreements are negotiated in good faith when tariffs are used as political weapons. Stop pretending that alliance commitments are reliable when the dominant power threatens to withdraw protection unless you pay more, buy more, concede more. The latest information shows that middle powers have been having this conversation privately for years. But nobody wanted to say it publicly because saying it out loud meant acknowledging that the system they depended on for security and prosperity no longer works. Carney said it out loud, and Australia's response was, yes, we see it too. But that's not even the most dangerous part. Here's what I'm not seeing enough people talk about. If the old order is dead and middle powers start building alternatives, what fills the vacuum? Carney's answer is variable geometry. Different coalitions for different issues based on common values and interests, not a formal alliance, not a new institution, just flexible networks that solve specific problems. Sources are now confirming that other countries are testing whether this actually works. Mexico is coordinating with Canada on USMCA renegotiations. Australia is working with Japan and India on Indo-Pacific supply chain resilience. Indonesia is talking to Canada about nickel processing partnerships. Each one is small, each one is tactical, but together they're building the infrastructure for a different kind of international system. Wait, it gets worse. Trump's response to all of this has been to escalate pressure. After Carney's speech, Trump threatened 100% tariffs on Canada if Ottawa signs a trade deal with China. But here's the twist. Carney wasn't negotiating a comprehensive deal with China. He was cutting tariffs on a few sectors. Trump's threat was designed to force Canada to choose us or them. Carney's response, we're pursuing 12 new deals on 4 continents. Not, we're not doing a deal with China. Not, we'll back down, we're expanding in every direction. We're diversifying so that no single relationship becomes a vulnerability. That is strategic autonomy in action. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture. Documents reveal that Canada's trade dependence on the U.S. has already started declining. It used to be 75% of exports went to America. Now it's closer to 67%. That might not sound like much, but in trade terms, that's massive diversification in a short period. And Carney's goal is to double non-U.S. exports. That would bring U.S. dependence down to around 50%, maybe lower. What does that mean strategically? It means Trump's tariff threats lose potency. If 75% of your exports go to one customer and they threaten tariffs, you have no choice but to comply. If 50% of your exports go to one customer, you have options. You can absorb the hit. You can retaliate. You can walk away from negotiations and find other partners. That's the game Carney is playing. And Australia is playing the same game. Their trade dependence on China has been declining for 5 years. They're building relationships with India, Japan, South Korea, the EU, and now Canada. Each new relationship reduces vulnerability to pressure from Beijing. Here's what kept me up last night. What if this works? What if Canada and Australia successfully build alternative trade networks? What if they prove that middle powers can coordinate effectively? What if other countries start joining? Then the entire structure of global power shifts because superpowers derive their leverage from the fact that middle powers depend on them. If that dependence decreases, so does the leverage. And if middle powers start setting their own agenda, great powers lose the ability to dictate terms. Reports are coming in that U.S. officials are watching this very closely, not because they think Canada and Australia can replace American power. They can't, but because they're worried about precedent. If middle powers start coordinating without Washington, what happens when there's a crisis? What happens when America needs allies to act together and those allies have their own agenda? What happens when with us or against us stops working because middle powers have built the capacity to say neither? That's the nightmare scenario from Washington's perspective. And it's exactly what Carney's Davos speech outlined as the path forward. So where does this actually go? Because here's the thing. Speeches are easy. Declarations are easy. Actually building functioning institutions that can coordinate policy across a dozen countries with different interests. That's hard, really hard. And the gap between what Carney outlined and what's actually achievable is where this story gets interesting. Let me walk you through the challenges. First, the economics. Canada and Australia can sign all the critical minerals deals they want, but China still controls 90% of rare earth processing. Building alternative processing capacity takes years and billions of dollars in investment. You need facilities, you need technology. You need workers with specialized skills. You need customers willing to pay potentially higher prices for materials that meet environmental standards. Can Canada and Australia actually deliver that? Sources are now confirming they're trying. The minerals agreement includes provisions for joint research on processing technologies. Both countries are using public financing to de-risk private investment. They're identifying specific projects, lithium in Australia, graphite in Canada, and coordinating government support. But here's the question. Will it be enough? And will it be fast enough to matter before the geopolitical window closes? Second, the politics. Even if the economics work, middle power coordination requires sustained political will. Elections happen, governments change. What happens if Australia elects a government that wants closer ties with Washington and less emphasis on middle power autonomy? What happens if Canada's opposition parties attack Carney for alienating America? The latest information shows this is already starting. Trump's pressure is designed to create domestic political costs for Carney, make him look reckless, make Canadians worry about economic consequences, force him to back down or pay a political price at home. Carney's betting that doubling down actually increases his political support, that Canadians want a leader who stands up to bullying, that showing strength abroad translates to strength at home, but that's a gamble. And if it fails, the entire middle power project loses momentum. Third, the coalition building. Canada and Australia are natural partners. Similar values, compatible systems, complementary resources, but expanding beyond that much harder. Mexico has different priorities. Indonesia has different constraints. Brazil has different relationships with China. South Korea is bound by alliance commitments to the U.S. Reports are coming in that some countries are interested but cautious. They like the idea of middle power coordination. They're worried about economic coercion from great powers, but they're not ready to publicly align the way Australia did. They want to see if Carney can deliver results before committing. That creates a chicken and egg problem. You need multiple countries committed to make the network strong enough to matter. But countries won't commit until they see the network is strong enough to matter. Carney's solutions start with the willing. Canada and Australia go first. They prove the model works. They deliver concrete benefits, trade deals, investment flows, supply chain resilience. Then others join because the value proposition is clear. But that only works if the first phase succeeds. And we're about to find out if it can. Now, here's what I'm watching for. March 2026, Carney addresses the Australian Parliament. What does he say? Does he announce new agreements? Does he name other countries joining the framework? Does he outline specific institutional structures like the proposed M50, an organization of the world's top 50 middle powers? If he shows up with just rhetoric, this fades. If he shows up with results, signed deals, committed funding, partner countries, this accelerates. The other thing I'm watching, Trump's reaction, does he escalate further? Does he actually impose the threatened tariffs? Does he try to split the coalition by offering Australia a better deal than Canada? Or does he realize that pressure is backfiring and try a different approach? Because here's what Trump might not have calculated. Every time he threatens Canada, he makes Carney's argument for him. Every time he demands loyalty without offering benefits, he pushes middle powers toward alternatives. Every time he uses economic leverage as a weapon, he proves that middle powers need protection from exactly that kind of coercion. Carney's Davos speech positioned Canada as a proof of concept for how middle powers can resist economic coercion. Trump's response, intentionally or not, has positioned the United States as the very force middle powers need protection from. That is almost certainly not the dynamic Washington intended to create. And here's what kept me up last night. We may be witnessing the early stages of a moment historians will someday circle and say, that was the inflection point. The moment when middle powers stopped treating great power rivalry as something they merely endure and began building the capacity to shape outcomes themselves. Or this could be something very different, a speech that generated attention without producing institutions, a flash of frustration that fades once the headlines move on. The difference between those two futures hinges entirely on what happens next. Can Carney and Albanese turn vision into infrastructure? Can they attract partners willing to move beyond rhetoric? Can they build networks that hold when pressure is applied? Sources indicate the next 6 months will answer those questions. By summer, we'll know whether the critical minerals framework is drawing real investment, whether the trade agreements Carney promised are materializing, and whether other middle powers are stepping forward or staying cautious. And we'll know whether Trump's pressure smothered this effort before it could take shape or accelerated the very realignment he was trying to stop. So I'm curious what you think. Does Australia's public alignment with Canada mark the beginning of a structural shift in how middle powers navigate great power competition? Or is this diplomatic theater that collapses at the first serious stress test? What am I missing? Let me know.